Imagine the wealthiest, the most dominant empire on Earth. Like, they control global trade. They fund the greatest art the world has ever seen.
Yeah.
Their military is practically untouchable.
Yeah.
And their economic policies dictate the fate of kings all across these different continents. Now, imagine that this entire empire doesn't possess a single acre of farmland.
Right. It's
Citizens literally live on wooden stilts hammered into a salty, barren, shifting swamp.
Yeah.
They have no fresh water source, no stone, no mineral wealth, and no solid ground. That is the impossible central paradox of the Venetian Republic.
It really is. It defies every traditional rule of empire building. Like you look at Rome, you look at the Han Dynasty or the British Empire, they all started with an abundance of natural resources.
Yeah, totally.
They had a geographic foundation that allowed for agricultural surplus, and that surplus fed armies which conquered more land. But Venice had absolutely none of that. They built an empire entirely out of water and, well, just aggressive pragmatism.
Welcome to this deep dive, by the way. Today, we are taking you on a really comprehensive chronological journey through one of the most bizarre and brilliant state structures in human history.
Definitely.
We're tracing the full arc of the Venetian Republic, from its miserable origins in a muddy lagoon to its zenith as a terrifying maritime superpower, and finally through its uniquely managed, centuries-long decline.
Right.
And to do this, we were relying heavily on Frederic Lane's seminal text, Venice, a Maritime Republic.
And Lane's work is just essential here because he fundamentally changes the lens through which we view Venice. So many histories get bogged down in the romantic mythology.
Oh, yeah. The gondolas?
Right, the gondolas, the Carnival masks, the Casanova legends. But Lane just strips all of that away. He treats the Venetian Republic like a hyper-efficient, highly paranoid, state-guided corporation.
I love that approach.
Yeah, he examines the actual ledgers, the shipyard logs, and the brutal economic calculus that allowed a literal mud bank to conquer the Mediterranean.
So we're going to bypass the dense academic jargon today and focus purely on the mechanics. We want to uncover those aha moments for you that explain how this city actually functioned.
Exactly.
Like, how do they build warships faster than anyone else on Earth? How do they manage mercenary armies without, getting conquered by them?
Or how did a tiny group of elites lock down total political power without sparking a peasant revolt? Because that happens everywhere else.
Right. So the narrative driving all of this is adaptation. Venice's entire 1,000-year history is basically a masterclass in turning severe geographic disadvantages into insurmountable strategic assets.
Yeah, their survival, their explosive growth, and their eventual sunset were dictated entirely by the physics and the economics of the sea.
So we have to go back to the literal mud. At the 5th and 6th centuries, the Western Roman Empire is completely collapsing.
It's a mess.
A total mess. Mainland Italy has essentially become a highway for invading armies. You have the Huns, you have the Lombards sweeping down the peninsula, burning cities and just slaughtering populations.
Right.
If you are a Roman citizen living in the Veneto region on the mainland, you are desperately looking for a place where men on horseback cannot follow you.
And so they flee to the one place the barbarian cavalry cannot navigate, the Venetian Lagoon.
Wow.
Yeah, this is a massive, shallow body of water separated from the Adriatic Sea by a few thin sandbars, what we now call the Lido, and the water inside the lagoon is incredibly treacherous.
Treacherous how? Like storms?
Well, no, it's filled with hidden mud banks, shifting tides, and these twisting deep water channels. Unless you intimately know the exact path to sail, your ship just runs aground immediately.
Oh, wow.
So the mainland refugees realize that this horrific, muddy terrain is actually the ultimate defensive shield.
I always try to picture the psychological toll, that transition.
Right.
You are a wealthy Roman family used to stone villas, paved roads, and sprawling wheat fields.
Yeah, and suddenly you're in a swamp.
Right. You are huddling in the damp, freezing fog of a salt marsh. You are literally hammering tree trunks deep into the muck, laying planks across them, and building a shack just to keep your family above the high tide.
It is a desperate, miserable existence. But, it provides life. They survive.
It provides life, yeah. But it creates an immediate existential crisis. Sustenance. Like, you cannot grow wheat in a salt marsh.
Right.
You cannot raise cattle on a submerged sandbar. And Frederic Lane points out that this environmental absolute is what fundamentally wired the Venetian mindset.
Absolutely. They had no internal agricultural capacity whatsoever. Therefore, from day one, they had to become merchants. I mean, if they did not trade, they would starve to death.
So they needed something to trade for that grain. And they looked at the only resource they had in abundance, saltwater.
Yeah, salt was the currency that built Venice. In the modern world, we think of salt as like a cheap condiment on our fries.
Yeah, it's nothing.
But in the Middle Ages, salt was the difference between surviving the winter and starving. It was the only viable method of preserving meat and fish before refrigeration.
Oh, right, of course.
So the Venetians figured out how to meticulously construct these shallow evaporation pans across the lagoon. They would let the sun evaporate the seawater, rake up the crystalline salt, and load it onto these shallow draft barges.
And they combine that salt with timber, right?
Exactly. They would sail up the rivers that fed into the lagoon, cut timber from the alpine forests, float it down to their islands, and then take both the salt and the wood to the mainland.
To trade for food.
Yes. They traded it to the mainland cities for the one thing they couldn't produce: grain. This basic exchange, salt and wood for food, basically forced them to master navigation, boat building, and negotiation.
That continuous motion really became their lifeblood. But operating a few barges of salt doesn't make you a global superpower. To scale up, Venice needed political cover and access to larger markets.
Right, they needed a bigger pond.
And they found both in the Byzantine Empire. When the Western Roman Empire fell, this muddy little lagoon technically remained a distant western outpost of the Eastern Roman Empire, which was centered in Constantinople.
This relationship is so fascinating. It really is.
I look at it like a scrappy modern startup incubating inside a massive legacy tech giant.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Venice is physically located in Western Europe, but they are legally and politically tied to the Byzantine parent company in the East.
That's a perfect analogy.
They use the Byzantine infrastructure, their naval protection, and their established trade routes to quietly build out their own logistics network.
And they played the role of the loyal vassal perfectly, but only when it suited them.
Naturally.
Byzantium was constantly fighting off naval threats in the Adriatic and the Mediterranean. You had Normans, Arabs, Slavic pirates. Byzantium had the wealth, but their navy was often completely overstretched.
Right.
So Venice, having spent centuries mastering shipbuilding just to survive, offered their naval services to the Byzantine emperor as basically a mercenary fleet.
They act as the parent company's private security and transport service.
Yeah.
And the payoff for this comes in the year 1082. Lane identifies this as a massive pivot point, the Golden Bull.
The Golden Bull of 1082. It was a decree issued by the Byzantine emperor Alexios the Komnenos. He desperately needed Venetian ships to fight off the Normans who were besieging the empire's western territories.
Okay.
So in exchange for their fleet, the emperor granted Venetian merchants something totally unprecedented: the right to trade freely throughout the entire Byzantine Empire, completely exempt from all taxes and customs duties.
Wait, zero taxes?
Zero, nothing.
I want to make sure the sheer scale of that advantage is clear to you listening. The Byzantine Empire controlled the richest markets in the Western world at the time. They controlled the flow of silk, spices, and perfumes coming from the Silk Road.
Huge, massive wealth.
If you are a merchant from Genoa or Pisa, you're paying massive tariffs to buy and sell those goods.
Yeah.
If you're a Venetian, you pay zero. You can undercut literally every single competitor in Europe.
Yeah, that tax exemption just transformed them into the indispensable middlemen of the medieval economy. They would load up their tax-free luxury goods in the East, sail them up the Adriatic to Venice.
And then just distribute them.
Exactly, distribute them through the river systems into France, Germany, and the Holy Roman Empire.
Okay, but I'm looking at the geopolitical reality of this, and it seems incredibly risky. By tying their entire economic engine to the Byzantine Empire, weren't they essentially strapping themselves to a sinking ship?
How do you mean?
Well, Byzantium was a legacy empire in slow decline. If Constantinople falls, or if a new emperor just decides to revoke that tax-free status, Venice goes bankrupt overnight.
Oh, absolutely, and that vulnerability was entirely recognized by the Venetian leadership, and it really reveals a core tenet of the Republic that Frederic Lane emphasizes repeatedly.
Which is?
Venice possessed a profound, almost chilling lack of sentimentality.
Wow. Cold business.
Completely cold. They had no romantic loyalty to Byzantium. They didn't view themselves as Roman patriots. Their allegiance was an incredibly cold business arrangement.
Just using for the tax break?
Yeah, they utilized the Byzantine umbrella to grow their own capital, build their own fleet, and establish their own trade routes. The moment Byzantium transitioned from being an asset to an obstacle, Venice was fully prepared to cut them loose. Or worse, actually, as we'll see later.
So they have the tax exemption, they have the geographical middleman position.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't monopolize global trade with just a piece of paper and some salt barges.
No, you need actual infrastructure.
Right, you need to physically transport thousands of tons of cargo across seas that are infested with pirates and rival navies. Which brings us to the most mind-bending technological marvel of the Middle Ages, the Venetian Arsenal.
Yes, founded in 1104. The Arsenal was essentially a walled city within the city of Venice, dedicated entirely to shipbuilding and naval logistics.
The city within a city.
Literally. Calling it a shipyard doesn't even do it justice. It was the largest industrial complex in Europe before the Industrial Revolution. Lane argues it was the world's first true assembly line factory.
Okay, walk us through the physical mechanics of this place. If I am standing inside the Arsenal in the 13th century, what am I actually looking at? How is it fundamentally different from how the rest of the world built ships?
Well, in a traditional medieval shipyard, a ship was built from the ground up in one spot. Master carpenters would fell trees, painstakingly carve each timber to fit a specific curve of the hull, custom make the oars, custom weave the sails.
Everything was bespoke.
Exactly. It took months, sometimes years, to build a single vessel, and every single ship was unique.
Right.
The Arsenal threw that artisanal method entirely in the garbage. They engineered a massive flowing canal through the center of the complex.
A water-based assembly line.
Yeah. At the very beginning of the water channel, the skeletal hull of a galley is constructed. Then the hull is literally floated down the canal, stopping at highly specialized workshops lining the water. At the first stop, a crew attaches the pre-cut planking. The hull floats to the next stop, where the calafati, the caulkers, seal the wood with pitch.
And they just keep moving it down the line.
Right. It floats to the tana, which was the massive rope factory within the Arsenal, where standardized rigging is dropped onto the deck. It floats to the weapons depot, where the ballistas and later cannons are mounted.
The standardization is the part that feels like it belongs in the 20th century, not the 1300s. I mean, Frederic Lane details how every single oar bench, every rudder, every mast was pre-manufactured to exact uniform specifications.
And that standardization was a massive strategic multiplier.
How so?
Think about it. If a Venetian merchant galley was caught in a storm off the coast of Egypt and snapped its rudder, they didn't have to wait a month for a local carpenter to carve a new custom one.
Oh, they just use a spare.
They simply sailed to the nearest Venetian outpost, pulled a standardized rudder out of the warehouse, locked it into place, and sailed on.
That is incredible.
At the absolute peak of its efficiency, during times of war, the Arsenal could take a bare hull, fully equip it, arm it, provision it, and sail it out into the lagoon in a single day.
A single day. The logistics of just feeding that machine are staggering. Where were they getting the raw materials? They live in a saltwater lagoon.
They engineered an incredible supply chain. They claimed vast tracts of oak and beech forests in the Cador region of the Alps.
Ah, okay. Up in the mountains.
Yeah, and they strictly regulated those forests. Like, no one was allowed to cut a tree without state permission. They would fell the trees, float the raw timber down the Piave River directly into the lagoon, and store the wood underwater in the Arsenal's basins to cure the sap out of it before shaping it.
That's brilliant.
They controlled the entire vertical integration of shipbuilding, from the forest to the fleet.
So they have the hardware. The state possesses this terrifying mass production military-industrial complex. But sending a ship full of wildly expensive spices across the Mediterranean is a massive financial risk.
Huge risk. Pirates, storms.
One pirate attack and a merchant family is just bankrupt. How did the state manage the actual business of trade?
Through an incredibly sophisticated public-private partnership known as the Muda system.
The Muda system.
Yeah. The Venetian Senate recognized that private merchants couldn't afford to build heavily armed warships to protect their own individual cargo, so the state stepped in.
Okay.
The Arsenal built what were called the Great Galleys, these massive, heavily armed, oar-powered merchant ships. The state owned these ships outright. The state provided the captain, the heavily armed Marines, and the oarsmen.
So they provided the military-grade armored transport, but the state didn't own the cargo.
Precisely. The state would publicly auction off the cargo space on these great galleys to private Venetian merchants.
Interesting.
A merchant would buy a percentage of the hold on a state convoy heading to Alexandria or heading to the Black Sea. The state dictated the exact schedule, the exact route, and provided impenetrable defense. The private merchant provided the capital and the goods.
It essentially eliminated the risk of piracy for the wealthiest merchants. It's like like the federal government building the interstate highway system, providing a heavily armed military escort for every single semi-truck, but letting private corporations own the freight inside.
That's a great way to put it.
It created an environment of supreme economic stability. But, that level of state coordination requires an incredibly tight political structure. You can't run a corporate empire of that scale if your government is constantly shifting or facing populist uprisings.
Definitely not.
Which brings us to a massive, cynical, and brilliant political engineering feat in the year 1297, the Serrata.
The Serrata, which translates to the closing of the Great Council. This is the exact moment Venice formalized its oligarchy.
Okay, set the stage for us. What was it like before?
Well, up until that point, the Great Council, which was the primary legislative and governing body of Venice, was relatively fluid. If a merchant became incredibly wealthy, he could use his influence to get elected to the council.
New money could get in.
Exactly. But by the late 13th century, the established patrician families, the ones controlling the massive Muta convoys, they looked around and decided they didn't want to share the levers of power with new money anymore.
They decided to permanently lock the door behind them.
Yeah, they basically pulled the ladder up. They passed a law, essentially stating that the only men eligible to sit on the Great Council are the men who are already on it.
Wow.
And their direct male descendants. They created a master registry, eventually known as the Golden Book. If your family name wasn't written in that Golden Book, you were permanently legally barred from holding high political office, no matter how much wealth you accumulated.
It transformed Venice from a semi-open republic into a rigid, hereditary patrician oligarchy, literally overnight. A tiny fraction of the population now wielded absolute, unchecked legislative, judicial, and executive power.
Yes, total control.
Okay, I have to stop the timeline here because this defies basic historical logic. Well, in almost every other European city-state at the time, like Florence, Milan, Genoa, if a tiny elite pulled the ladder up and permanently locked the working and middle classes out of power, it resulted in a massive, bloody peasant revolt. The people burned the palazzos to the ground.
Right, that was the standard outcome.
So why didn't Venice burn? How did a few hundred families hoard all political power for 5 centuries without facing a guillotine?
That is the genius of the Venetian institutional design. Lane dedicates significant time to this because it's the secret to their longevity.
Okay, I'm listening.
The Serrata survived, and the city remained remarkably peaceful because of 2 distinct mechanisms. Extreme internal meritocracy among the elites and a meticulously crafted social safety net for everyone else.
Explain the meritocracy among the elites first, because usually hereditary power breeds really lazy, incompetent aristocrats.
In Venice, being a patrician listed in the Golden Book was not a license to lounge around at a palace. The state demanded brutal, often dangerous public service from its elites.
Brutal how?
If you were a patrician, you were legally obligated to command the galleys in times of war, often at your own personal expense. You were sent as ambassadors to hostile courts. You administered disease-ridden colonies.
Oh.
If you refused a state assignment, you were heavily fined or exiled. Furthermore, the patricians were absolutely paranoid about any single family among them seizing autocratic power.
They were terrified of a Julius Caesar figure emerging.
Exactly. They looked at the rest of Italy falling under the control of single despotic families, the Medici in Florence, the Visconti in Milan, and designed a system to prevent it.
Right.
The Doge, the leader of Venice, was essentially a figurehead, heavily surveilled and stripped of unilateral power. And the election process to choose a Doge was intentionally, comically convoluted to prevent bribery or factional rigging.
The election math is unbelievable. Walk us through how they actually picked a Doge. It involves urns and wooden balls, right?
Yeah, it was a multi-stage lottery mixed with voting. When a Doge died, all the members of the Great Council over the age of 30 gathered.
Hundreds of guys.
Hundreds. They would draw 30 wooden balls from an urn to randomly select 30 men.
Okay.
Those 30 would then draw lots to reduce themselves to 9.
Right.
Those 9 would vote to elect 40 patricians.
Wait, elect them from the whole council?
Yes. Then those 40 would draw lots to reduce themselves to 12.
This is exhausting.
It gets better. Those 12 would vote for 25. Those 25 drew lots down to 9. Those 9 voted for 45.
Oh my God.
Those 45 drew lots down to 11, and finally, those 11 voted for the 41 men who would actually cast the final deciding vote for the new Doge.
It is an algorithm designed by paranoid geniuses. I mean, you couldn't bribe the electors because you had absolutely no idea who the electors were going to be until the final afternoon of the process.
Exactly. It was mathematically impossible to rig.
So the elites keep each other perfectly balanced. But what about the commoners? What stopped the shipwrights and the glassblowers from rising up?
The state provided them with a parallel power structure through institutions called the School Grandi.
The school.
Yes. These were massive, wealthy confraternities, essentially a mix of a guild, a religious charity, and a social club.
Okay.
If you were a wealthy commoner, say the master of the Glassblowers Guild, you couldn't sit on the Great Council. But you could become the grand guardian of one of the schools.
You gave them a different ladder to climb.
Exactly. The school controlled immense budgets. They commissioned jaw-dropping art from painters like Titian and Tintoretto. They built magnificent headquarters.
So it offered prestige.
Lots of prestige. And most importantly, they provided a comprehensive social safety net for the lower classes. They provided dowries so poor women could marry. They funded hospitals. They provided pensions for widows of sailors who died at sea.
Wow.
The state funneled the wealth of the middle class into social stability.
It is the ultimate corporate benefits package. The state realizes that if you give the workers great health care, a solid pension, and a sense of prestige within their own department, they won't try to overthrow the executive board.
It is deeply cynical social engineering, but it worked flawlessly.
It really did. So, by the early 1300s, Venice has an untouchable industrial base in the arsenal, state-protected logistics, and absolute domestic peace. They are a coiled spring.
And when you have that much concentrated capital and zero domestic turmoil, you inevitably project power outward. You shift from merchants to imperialists.
Which brings us to the moment where the startup violently acquires the parent company. The Fourth Crusade in 1204. Frederic Lane points to this as the ultimate manifestation of Venetian pragmatism overriding any sense of religious or cultural loyalty.
Oh, absolutely.
Set the stage for us. What happens?
Okay, so in the late 12th century, Pope Innocent III calls for a new crusade to recapture Jerusalem from Muslim control. A massive army of French and Flemish knights answers the call.
Okay.
But to get an army of that size across the sea to the Holy Land, they need a fleet. And only one state on Earth possessed the shipyard capacity to build that fleet. Venice?
So the Crusaders send envoys to Venice and negotiate a contract with the Doge Enrico Danilo. Now, Doge Danilo is one of the most terrifying figures in medieval history.
He really is.
He is in his 90s. He is completely blind. But his mind is just a steel trap. He agrees to build transport ships for 33,000 men and 4,500 horses.
Huge order.
Plus provide a full year of provisions and a heavily armed Venetian escort fleet. The price is astronomical, 85,000 silver marks.
Venice essentially suspends all its other commercial trade for a year. The arsenal works day and night to build this armada.
Right.
But when the Crusader army finally arrives in Venice to board the ships, there is a catastrophic problem.
And the soldiers don't show up.
Exactly. Only about a third of the expected soldiers show up. And they don't have the money. They are vastly short of the 85,000 marks.
The Crusaders are stranded on the island of the Lido, sweltering in the summer heat, literally melting down their personal armor and jewelry trying to pay the bill.
Yeah, they're desperate.
And Doge Danilo, the blind pragmatist, sees the greatest business opportunity of his life. He essentially tells them, we built the ships, the debt is owed, but we are willing to defer the payment if you do us a small favor on your way to the Holy Land.
The first favor Danilo demands is for this holy army of Christian knights to help Venice recapture the city of Zara, located across the Adriatic Sea on the Dalmatian coast.
Wait, Zara was a Christian city, right?
Yes. It was held by the King of Hungary, who had actually taken the Crusader vow himself. The Pope explicitly forbids this. He threatens to excommunicate the entire army if they attack Zara.
But Danilo intercepts the papal letters, hides the excommunication threat from the rank-and-file soldiers, and the Crusaders sack the Christian city of Zara simply to pay down their shipping debt to Venice.
It is a medieval repo job.
It's insane, and that was merely the appetizer. Through a deeply convoluted series of political maneuvers involving an exiled claimant prince to the Byzantine throne, Danilo manages to pivot the entire crusade away from Jerusalem entirely.
He points the largest army in Europe directly at Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire.
The very empire that had protected Venice centuries before.
The Crusaders breached the walls of Constantinople in 1204. The ensuing sack is one of the most brutal, systematic lootings in world history.
Christian knights slaughtering Christian citizens, stripping the gold from the Hagia Sophia. And Venice, naturally, manages the plunder with corporate efficiency.
While the French knights are busy looting relics and burning libraries, the Venetians are executing a targeted acquisition of real estate. Frederic Lane calculates that Venice claimed, quote, 3/8 of the Roman Empire.
3/8.
But what they took is critical to understanding their strategy. They didn't take vast inland territories in Greece or Anatolia.
They didn't want to govern dirt. They wanted the infrastructure.
Precisely. They took a continuous chain of islands, deep-water ports, and coastal fortresses stretching from the Adriatic down around Greece, through the Aegean Sea, and right up to the Black Sea. Crete, Euboea, the Ionian Islands.
All the stepping stones.
Yes. This became the Stato de Mar, the state of the sea.
It is an empire of bases. They established a logistics chain where a Venetian merchant ship could sail from Venice to Crimea and never be more than a few days' sail from a heavily fortified Venetian-owned port,
where they could resupply, repair at a mini-arsenal, and find safe harbor from pirates. It locked down a total monopoly on Eastern trade.
But monopolies breed rivals.
Yeah.
By securing the Eastern Mediterranean, Venice triggered an existential, century-long death match with the only other maritime power capable of challenging them, the Republic of Genoa.
Located on the western coast of Italy, Genoa was Venice's dark mirror. They were brilliant sailors, aggressive merchants, and they wanted access to the Black Sea grain and the Alexandrian spice markets.
And the rivalry between Venice and Genoa wasn't just like a trade dispute over tariffs. It was a series of total wars of annihilation. And it culminated in the War of Chioggia from 1378 to 1381.
The War of Chioggia is the moment the Venetian Republic came within inches of being completely wiped off the map.
What happened?
For centuries, Venice had relied on the treacherous geography of their lagoon to protect them. But in 1379, the Genoese fleet achieved the unthinkable. They sailed up the Adriatic, defeated the Venetian navy at sea, and actually breached the southern entrance of the lagoon, capturing the town of Chioggia.
The Genoese are physically inside the lagoon. They blockade the deep water channels. Venice is cut off from the sea, cut off from their grain shipments, and they are starving.
They're trapped.
The enemy is literally looking at the Campanile as St. Mark's from their ship decks. How do they survive when their geographic shield fails?
They survive because of the immense social cohesion built by the Serrata and the school.
Oh, the safety net pays off.
Big time. The city did not fracture into civil war, which is exactly what Genoa expected. Instead, they enacted total civic mobilization. The wealthy patricians voluntarily handed over their fortunes, melting down silver plates and church reliquaries to fund the rapid construction of a new fleet inside the arsenal.
And the tactical trap they spring is brilliant. They realize they can't defeat the heavy Genoese fleet in a straight fight, so they use their intimate, terrifying knowledge of the lagoon's mud against the invaders.
Under the cover of darkness, Venetian mariners sail ships filled to the brim with heavy stones out to the deep water channels that connect Chioggia to the open sea. They scuttle the ships, sinking them directly in the narrowest points of the channels. They literally lock the Genoese fleet inside the lagoon.
They trap the besiegers.
Yeah. The Genoese couldn't navigate their heavy galleys over the mudbanks to escape. Venice brings down a secondary fleet, blockades the blockaders, and starves the Genoese into unconditional surrender.
That is incredible.
It broke the back of Genoese naval supremacy forever.
So following the War of Chioggia, Venice is the undisputed, unchallenged master of the Mediterranean. There is no naval power left that can threaten their convoys. But ironically, this absolute maritime dominance forces them to make a massive, risky pivot.
Yeah, a huge shift.
Which brings us to the 15th century and the creation of the Domini di Terraferma, the mainland empire. Now, we established at the very beginning that Venice was born by fleeing the land.
Right, they hated the land.
Their entire identity, their defense, their economy was based on water. Why, at the absolute height of their naval power, do they suddenly launch a massive military campaign to conquer the dirt right next door?
It comes down to demographics and the terrifying vulnerability of their supply chain.
Of food.
Exactly. By the 1400s, Venice is absurdly wealthy, and its population has exploded to over 150,000 people living on islands that still do not produce a single ear of corn.
Wow.
They are entirely reliant on importing vast fleets of grain from the Black Sea, Egypt, and Sicily.
It is the ultimate bottleneck. If a plague hits the Black Sea ports, or if a storm sinks the grain convoy, Venice starves in a matter of weeks. They realize that a superpower cannot outsource its caloric survival.
Exactly. They needed their own agricultural base. They needed to control the rivers that emptied into the lagoon to ensure their trade routes into Europe weren't taxed or blockaded by aggressive mainland dukes in Milan or Verona.
So they just bought it.
So they used their vast commercial wealth to simply buy an empire. They conquer Padua, Verona, Vicenza, Bergamo.
I look at this expansion like a massive, dominant cloud computing company today. You know, they rule the digital realm, the sea, and they have endless capital. But they realize that to keep the cloud running, they ultimately need physical infrastructure. They need server farms. They need power grids. They need grocery chains for their employees.
That makes total sense.
So they start buying up massive tracts of physical real estate to support their virtual empire. Venice buys the mainland to feed the sea.
It's a perfect analogy. But conquering land requires armies. And Venice, being a naval power of merchants, did not have a standing army of foot soldiers.
Right.
So they hired them. They employed massive mercenary armies led by independent generals known as the condottieri.
Now, this is another mechanical puzzle. Renaissance Italy was defined by mercenary armies. But the fatal flaw of hiring a massive, heavily armed mercenary force is that the general usually realizes, wait, you're paying me to conquer a city for you? Why don't I just conquer your city for myself?
That happened constantly in Italy.
How did Venice manage the condottieri without suffering a military coup?
Frederic Lane outlines the strict, deeply paranoid oversight system the Senate implemented. Whenever a mercenary general was hired by Venice, the state assigned a civilian commissioner, a patrician known as a proveditore, to ride alongside him in the military camp.
Like a political officer.
Exactly. The proveditore controlled the payroll. The mercenary general couldn't pay his troops unless the civilian commissioner physically unlocked the chest.
Oh, that's smart.
The state also cultivated massive spy networks within the mercenary camps, constantly pitting sub-commanders against their generals to ensure no one gained too much personal loyalty.
They institutionalized distrust. And it worked. They carved out a massive mainland state securing their food supply. And this era, the 1400s and early 1500s, this is the commercial and cultural peak.
The golden age.
The spice monopoly is absolute. Venetian galleys are picking up pepper, nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon in Alexandria, bringing it to Venice and selling it to German merchants at a 400% markup.
400%. And they dominated not just logistics, but luxury manufacturing. We have to look at the glass blowers of Murano.
Oh yeah, Murano glass.
Venice concentrated all their glass furnaces on the island of Murano. Now, the official reason they gave was to prevent fires from burning down the wooden structures of the main city.
But the real reason was corporate espionage and intellectual property protection.
Exactly. Murano glass was the most advanced clear glass in the world. It was a massive state secret. By isolating the artisans on one island, the state could heavily surveil them. It was a golden cage.
A golden cage.
The glassblowers were given incredible privileges. They could carry swords, their daughters could marry into patrician families, but they were forbidden from leaving the Republic.
Under penalty of death, right?
Literally. If a master glassblower tried to defect to France to sell his secrets, the Venetian state literally sent assassins to track him down and eliminate him to protect the monopoly.
They enforced patents with daggers.
Yeah.
And all of this wealth, the spices, the glass, the silk, it flooded into the city and funded the visual explosion of the Venetian Renaissance.
Right, the art we all know.
When you look at the masterpieces of Titian, Bellini, Giorgione, they aren't primarily funded by the Pope or a single king like in other places. They are funded by the Skol Grandi and the merchant families.
It is corporate wealth physically manifesting itself in oil paint and marble to project an aura of invincibility.
But it wasn't invincible. It was invincible for a time. But conquering the terra firma created a fatal structural trap.
Lane argues that the moment Venice acquired a land empire, they permanently entangled themselves in the brutal, endless, massively expensive land wars of European politics.
Right.
They were now sharing borders with the Habsburgs, the French, and the Papal States. They had to maintain expensive standing armies and fortify inland cities. It slowly drained capital, manpower, and political focus away from the sea, which was the true source of their wealth.
They completely overextended themselves. They were trying to be the lords of the sea and the lords of the land simultaneously. And because their focus is split, they are supremely vulnerable to the two catastrophic shock waves that are about to hit them. Which brings us to the final act of the Republic, the long sunset. The map of the world is about to be violently redrawn, and it erodes the geographic foundations of Venetian power. The first shockwave is geopolitical and military, the rise of the Ottoman Empire.
In 1453, the unthinkable happens. The Ottoman Turks breach the massive walls of Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire, the parent company, is finally erased from history.
Wow.
The Ottomans are a terrifyingly efficient, centralized military machine. And unlike the disjointed Arab states or the decaying Byzantine Empire, the Ottomans possess the resources to build a navy capable of challenging Venice.
And they want the Mediterranean.
They don't just want to trade in the Eastern Mediterranean, they want to conquer it entirely. This kicks off 3 centuries of grueling, incredibly expensive wars of attrition.
Venice fights brilliantly, though. They win massive tactical victories. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 is one of the largest naval engagements in history. A coalition fleet led by Venice absolutely crushes the Ottoman navy.
Lepanto was a spectacular tactical victory, but strategically it was a hollow triumph.
Why is that?
It proved that Venice was fighting the tide. Even after losing their entire fleet, the Ottoman Empire had the vast inland forests of Anatolia and the demographic depth to rebuild their navy entirely within a single year.
Oh, wow. 1 year.
Venice simply could not replace ships and men at that scale anymore. Over the decades, they slowly bleed out. They lose their island fortresses. They lose Cyprus. They lose Crete. The Stato de Mar is slowly dismantled piece by piece.
So they're bleeding heavily in the east. But the second shockwave is what truly breaks the machine, and it doesn't involve a single cannonball. It's purely geographic and economic. The earthquake hits in 1498.
1498. Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese explorer, rounds the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa and discovers a direct, all-water route to India.
I want to pause and map this out, because this is huge. For centuries, Venice was wealthy because of geography. If a merchant in Germany wanted pepper from India, that pepper had to travel by camel across the Middle East to the Red Sea, up to Alexandria in Egypt, where a Venetian ship was waiting to buy it, sail it across the Mediterranean, and sell it in Europe.
Venice was the mandatory toll booth. You had to go through them.
Da Gama's voyage completely shattered that premise. Now, the Portuguese could load massive, deep-hulled galleons in Lisbon, sail down the coast of Africa, straight across the Indian Ocean, load the holds directly with spices, and sail straight back to Europe.
They entirely bypassed the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and Venice.
The middleman just got permanently cut out. I look at this the exact same way I look at Blockbuster Video. The moment broadband internet and streaming became viable.
It's a really good comparison.
Blockbuster had a perfect logistical empire of physical retail stores. But the geography of the internet completely bypassed their physical locations. The business model was rendered obsolete by a new route.
It is the exact same dynamic. The center of gravity of the global economy shifted overnight from the Mediterranean Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. The global map expanded, and the Mediterranean became an economic backwater.
But wait, let's carry that analogy through. Blockbuster failed because they couldn't pivot their infrastructure fast enough. But Venice had the greatest mariners in the world. They had the Arsenale. When they saw the Portuguese bringing spices directly to Lisbon, why didn't the Venetians just build their own galleons, sail out of the Mediterranean, pass Spain, and compete in the Atlantic?
That is the ultimate tragic irony of their technological supremacy. Frederic Lane breaks down the naval mechanics perfectly here.
What were the mechanics?
The Venetian Great Galley was an apex predator, but it was highly specialized for a very specific environment. It was sleek, fast, shallow-drafted, and relied on hundreds of oarsmen to navigate the calm, windless days of the Mediterranean Sea.
But if you take a shallow draft oar-powered galley out into the massive rough swells of the Atlantic Ocean,
it gets torn apart immediately. Furthermore, because a galley requires hundreds of rowers, almost all the interior cargo space is dedicated just to carrying fresh water and food to keep the rowers alive.
so they can't go far.
Exactly. They cannot make long ocean voyages. The Portuguese and Spanish galleons, on the other hand, were deep-hulled, entirely wind-powered by complex sails, and required very small crews. They could cross oceans.
Venice's greatest asset, their hyper-specialized Mediterranean technology, was fundamentally incompatible with the Atlantic swells. They were trapped in their own perfect design.
Trapped, exactly.
So they are facing insurmountable military pressure from the Ottomans in the east. And their core economic monopoly has been structurally bypassed by the Atlantic powers in the west. By all historical metrics, Venice should have collapsed into bankruptcy, civil war, and ruin within a decade.
Absolutely.
But they don't.
And this is where Frederic Lane's analysis is so brilliant. The decline of Venice was not a sudden, chaotic collapse. It was a 300-year, meticulously managed, highly profitable sunset.
300 years. Most empires don't last 3 centuries at their absolute peak. How on earth did they manage to decline for that long?
The patrician elites looked at the ledgers. They saw that outfitting galleys to fight the Ottomans or compete with the Portuguese was yielding diminishing returns. So, using that famous Venetian lack of sentimentality we talked about, they divested from the sea.
They just walked away.
They took the vast generational wealth they had accumulated over centuries of trade, and they pivoted their investments into the safest asset they had, the terra firma.
The mainland soil, the ultimate retirement plan.
Precisely. The aggressive, risk-taking sea merchants transformed themselves into landed aristocrats. They poured capital into massive land reclamation projects, draining marshes in the Veneto to plant vast, highly profitable estates of wheat and maize.
Right.
They hired the architect Andrea Palladio to design magnificent, perfectly symmetrical stone villas on their new estates. They shifted from commercial imperialism to domestic agriculture.
And what about the city itself, the arsenal, the canals? What happens to the islands?
They pivoted the city's economy from a global logistics hub to a luxury boutique. They knew they couldn't compete in bulk spice trade anymore, so they leveraged their cultural capital. They heavily subsidized domestic industries that required high skill but low shipping volumes.
Like what?
Venice became the printing and publishing capital of Europe. They dominated the luxury markets: fine lace, exquisite glass, high-end jewelry.
And they essentially invented the modern concept of luxury tourism, didn't they?
They really did. They realized that their city was physically stunning and steeped in myth. This is the era of the Grand Tour. Wealthy aristocrats from England, France, and Germany would travel to Venice specifically to gamble in the state-sanctioned casinos, attend the endless decadent carnival, buy high-end art, and experience the romance of the Republic.
Venice effectively monetized its own history.
They turned themselves into a museum where the wealthy elite of Europe came to spend their money. It provided incredible domestic stability. The Serrata held, the school continued to provide the social safety net, and the city remained stunningly beautiful and culturally vibrant for centuries after its geopolitical power had vanished.
They managed a dignified retreat. It wasn't until 1797, when Napoleon Bonaparte marched into the Veneto with a modern, mass-conscripted artillery army, that the Republic finally surrendered.
And even then, Napoleon didn't conquer a terrifying military empire. He basically marched in and foreclosed on a very elegant, very old casino.
The structural foundations of their power had been hollowed out by the Atlantic shift centuries prior. Napoleon simply signed the death certificate.
Exactly.
What an unbelievable trajectory. We started with desperate, terrified refugees hammering wooden posts into a freezing mudflat to escape the Huns. We saw them meticulously construct salt evaporation pans, leveraging that meager resource to become indispensable middlemen under the Byzantine umbrella.
We explored the mechanical genius of the Arsenal, mass-producing standardized warships on a flowing canal centuries before the Industrial Revolution.
We saw the cynical, stabilizing political engineering of the Serrata, locking down elite power while bribing the working class with a school grande.
We watched Doge Dandolo violently hijack a crusade to build an empire of island bases, and we saw them trap the Genoese fleet in their own muddy waters.
And finally, we watched them gracefully manage a 3-century-long sunset, when the discovery of the Atlantic routes completely bypassed their geographic advantage, pivoting from sea lords to landed aristocrats and luxury purveyors.
Frederic Lane's history strips away all the masks and the romance, revealing a Venice that was a masterpiece of institutional design, a fiercely pragmatic corporate state perfectly adapted to the physics of its environment.
And that concept of adaptation leaves us with a lingering, provocative thought to consider for you listening. Venice built a 1,000-year empire by perfectly, flawlessly adapting to the geography and the technology of its era. They mastered the Mediterranean.
But when the global map changed, when da Gama bypassed them, no amount of internal efficiency, no perfectly designed political institution, and no mass production shipyard could save their dominance.
It didn't matter how fast the Arsenal could build a galley, because a galley was fundamentally the wrong piece of technology for the new ocean.
So look at the structures, the institutions, the massive tech monopolies, or even the cities you rely on today. They might seem completely invincible right now, perfectly adapted to our current technological and economic landscape.
Right.
But are they building an empire for a map that is about to change? And what happens to them when someone, somewhere, discovers a new route, a new technology or paradigm that renders their entire foundation, their entire perfect design, structurally obsolete overnight?
It always goes back to the foundation. You can build the most magnificent, efficient, perfectly balanced structure in the world, but if you realize too late that the water is shifting beneath you, the tide is eventually going to come in. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep exploring the mechanics behind the mythology and keep questioning the foundations of the world around you.